war. A state of armed conflict between two different countries or different groups within a country. Cold War. A state of political hostility between countries characterized by threats, propaganda, and other measures short of open warfare. Hero. A person who is admired for their courage, outstanding achievements, or noble qualities. Stanislav Petrov. Hero? Well, what else would you call the man credited with saving the world? This is the story of the day the world almost ended. Just briefly, before we get into Stanislav Petrov, we need to go down memory lane for a bit of a brief history lesson. So following the end of World War II in 1945, while this was supposed to be a time of joy, and for the most part it was, geopolitical tensions never really subsided, especially between that of the United States of America and the Soviet Union. Tensions between the two juggernauts were constantly growing over the future of Europe. Constant disagreements over post-war reconstruction, not to mention the establishment of what is now known as the sphere of influence, laid the initial groundwork for the Cold War. In terms of the spheres of influence, those took the form of the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc, and you can think of these as teams. The Western Bloc was captained by the USA and flanked by a bunch of other capitalist and liberal democratic nations, as well as authoritarian third world countries, and that made up that team. The main nations that made up this team would be the USA, the United Kingdom, France, Taiwan, Western Germany, Italy, Canada, Portugal, South Korea, and South Vietnam, and we'll get to that one shortly. The Western Bloc was much more of a communist nature with influences on the Second World. Yeah, but you didn't know there was a Second World as well as a First and Third World. This team would be captained by the Soviet Union and would be flanked by China, briefly, Romania, Eastern Germany, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, North Korea, and North Vietnam. This would lead to the formation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact in 1949. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is an alliance between 32 member nation states and their militaries. 30 of them are European, 2 of them are North American. The Warsaw Pact, which has since been dissolved and is now known as the CSTO, or the Collective Security Treaty Organization, further exacerbated tensions because now you've got even bigger alliances that were formed following the end of World War II, and the political divide between the West and the East was now even greater than it had ever been. Not to mention that around the same time, we had the blockade and the airlift of Berlin, where the Soviets blockaded West Berlin, effectively cutting off aid to that part of the city, leading to a massive airlift effort where the US and its allies swooped in to provide the divided city's civilians with supplies, further dividing an already divided Europe. The next few years were also marred with conflict, as in 1950 the war between the Korean nations kicked off, and this conflict, while deep-seated in many years of tensions between the North and South divide of a once united nation, it served mostly as a proxy war for two other nations. The North was supported by the Soviets and China, while the South was actually led by the US, and the US military intervened on behalf of South Korea so that they could stop the spread of basically communism. Following the end of that conflict in Southeast Asia, a few years would go by with the US and the Soviets kind of not trying to battle each other, especially just focusing on the political side, and actually they decided to try and literally beat each other in a competition into space. And when I said competition, this basically became a full-on competition, never mind a geopolitical conflict. It was dick measuring at its finest. Between the mid-50s and the mid-70s, both sides were trying to show off both their scientific and military acumen. I mean, we sent dogs to space, we sent men to space, we launched satellites, we landed on the moon, and with that landing on the moon, the US was basically declared the winners of the space race. That is, if they really did land on the moon. Just kidding, of course they did. It's a metal rod. It's a metal rod. From here, there is going to be a little bit of overlap here and there because things happened at the same time with some other things, but try and focus. Because with the space race taking up around like 20 years of time, that didn't stop things on the ground from continuing in the worst ways possible. For instance, running alongside the space race and almost in tandem was the Vietnam War, described as a flashpoint of US-Soviet tensions. The Soviets provided their support to the northern section of Vietnam, with the US yet again leading the fight from the south in a literal fight against the spread of communism in Southeastern Asia. The US was majorly criticized for their involvement in this conflict. Like, it was kind of a moment of like, why are you even here?
She doesn't even go here.
Not to mention that the US lost. I mean, Vietnam is still, to this day, a one-party socialist country, and while there is a difference between communism and socialism, the lines between the two are very blurred. Socialism is often seen as a traditional first step towards communism. However, the two have very different states of mind in terms of things like ownership and distribution of wealth. And while the US at the time was fighting on behalf of the southern part of Vietnam, many of the citizens of the South agreed with the North. So, in the end, was the loss of life, civilian life very much included, worth it? The sheer amount of deaths on the US side was needless to say the least, and the use of napalm and Agent Orange drew major scrutiny, especially in the years that followed and everything that's happened since, like all the birth defects and stuff. Also during this time you have the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, with this being the closest the US and the Soviets came to a full-scale nuclear war. Basically, Soviet nuclear weapons were found in Cuba, with Cuba and the US also being in rocky waters at that time, to say the least. Looking at you, Operation Mongoose. I'm sure that'll be something that we look into in the future. Ultimately, while US-Soviet tensions rose dramatically during this time, a resolution was eventually reached, but it did highlight just how much danger the Cold War was dancing with. Following the end of all of that, tensions did begin to die down, with a major focus on arms control agreements and more political engagement. And they still didn't trust each other, not by a long shot, but they were at least trying to prevent a major conflict. At least that was until the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, where the Red State tried to support the rise of a communist government in the country, which, as you can probably guess, outraged the United States. The US provided support to the Mujahideen, an Afghan, I think I butchered that name, but it's an Afghan resistance force pushing the Cold War almost into a battleground, with Afghanistan being the ground. Then, to make matters even just that little bit worse, the US elected a new leader in Ronald Reagan, and he really didn't like the Soviet Union, denouncing the state as an evil empire and advocating for a huge buildup in the US military, even going as far as to create the US Strategic Defense Initiative, dubbed Star Wars. The SDI aimed to make what is essentially what the Iron Dome that Israel has today, but an 80s version of it that would have, that would have had to be on a ginormous scale, considering the US is like over 450 times larger than Israel by landmass. But again, Reagan was doing his best to show the American public how much he was against the Soviets and the rise of communism. And thus leading us to 1983. As we've probably already established, the US and South Korea are allies, so when Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian airliner, strayed into Soviet airspace, the Soviets shot the Boeing 747 out of the sky, ending the lives of all 269 people on board. And here's a breakdown of all the passengers by nationality that were lost on that day. And that is a lot of Americans to murder when you're already on the brink of war. especially when one of those passengers was Larry McDonald, Georgia's 7th Congressional District Representative in the United States House of Representatives. And what makes this even crazier was that this flight was a flight that took off from JFK Airport in New York and stopped for a layover in Anchorage, Alaska, with its final destination being Gimpo International Airport in Seoul, South Korea. And the initial flight plan was to fly down towards Japan, fly over Kennesaw and Niigata, completely butchered that one, before curving to the right and landing in Seoul. However, this was not the route that was taken. Thanks to the autopilot system of the plane, Flight 007 was basically told to fly in what is essentially a straight line between Anchorage and Seoul, which would have took them over Kamchatka Peninsula. They would continue flying until they flew over Sakhalin Island, where it would be unceremoniously shot down. The autopilot system was operating in heading mode as opposed to INS mode. INS mode, or inertial navigation system, maintains a plane on a lateral course between lines that are selected in a flight plan, and like waypoints have been programmed into the INS computer. So if you say go here, here, and here, the plane will naturally follow those lines. But if you leave the plane in heading mode, it's more of an as the crow flies type of setting. General Valery Kamensky wanted that aircraft destroyed. However, he wanted to make sure that the aircraft wasn't civilian. But that's when General Anatoly Kurnikov stepped in. He was commander of the Sokol Air Base and would later become commander of the Russian Air Force. And he did not care if it was civilian or not. He wanted that plane destroyed. The pursuing Soviet interceptor jets noticed that the plane had started taking evasive maneuvers, with them overshooting the plane and flying ahead of it. But this wasn't the case. This is just what they said happened. Flight 007 had actually radioed the Tokyo Air Control Center, requesting clearance to ascend to a higher level to conserve fuel. Obviously, the thinner the air, the less fuel you have to use to burn through it. But this request would be granted, allowing the plane to climb, and the pilot would exchange speed for altitude, causing the jets to overshoot, and this would be taken as an evasive tactic. And under the black of night, they couldn't tell if the plane was military or civilian, since they claimed that the aircraft didn't have any lights on. The pilot of one of the jets would loop back around, so he was underneath the plane, pull the nose of his aircraft up sharply, lock on, and fire his missiles. The plane a minute later would break apart after spiraling towards the ocean, and ended the lives of 269 people in one short second. This would be followed by a bunch of lies from the Soviets. They didn't admit to it because they thought no one would be able to prove they had done it, and they thought that if they didn't say anything, no one would find out. This whole thing took place on the 1st of September, 1983, and it wasn't until almost a week later, following a presentation given to the United Nations Security Council by Jeane Kirkpatrick, that TASS, or the Telegraph Agency of the Soviet Union, acknowledged that the flight had indeed been shot down after warnings from the interceptors had been ignored, and would go on to say that the plane was on a spy mission. What made you think that? So, obviously, tensions, and I've used that word a lot, but they were constantly growing and just would not let up, with the Soviets even calling this a portent of war, an event that indicates a war is likely in the future. And thus, again, leading us to the 26th of September, 1983. Bruce G. Blair, an expert on Cold War nuclear strategies, once said that the Soviet Union, as an entire system, was geared towards expecting an attack and to retaliate to that attack very quickly. And what happened on the 26th of September couldn't have come at a more dangerous phase of the US-Soviet tensions. So keep that in mind. Everybody in the Soviet military, from the very top to the very bottom, had had it drilled into them that the Americans were going to attack any day. And when, not if, they did, they needed to strike back as quickly as possible. Serpukhov 15 is essentially a small town made specifically for the military, which is situated close to Kurilovo in Kaluga Oblast. It would be in Serpukhov 15 that we would find Stanislav Petrov. A lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Force, Petrov would be the officer on duty that night in the Serpukhov 15 bunker. The bunker would house the command center for the Soviets' early missile warning systems, codenamed OKO. And Stanislav's job in this bunker was actually pretty simple. Man the early warning system and then notify his superiors should everything suddenly start going to hell in a handbasket. If those early warning systems went off, telling the Soviets that the US had launched an attack, it was compulsory that the Soviets fire back immediately with an offensive counterstrike. This is known as launch on warning, and it's also known as mutually assured destruction. In the vein of, if I'm dying, so are you. So this shift was actually typical for Stanislav. Nothing different from usual. The clock just ticking past midnight when all of a sudden, the warning systems triggered. The computers in the bunker were reporting that a single ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, was barreling towards the Soviet Union, and it was heading towards them from the direction of the United States. This was it. This was war. But wait, one single ICBM? That couldn't be right. Stanislav knew his orders. If the system detects an incoming missile, alert the higher-ups and the counterstrike can begin. So why did Stanislav do nothing? He didn't alert anybody. Stanislav considered the detection to be a glitch or an error in the detection software or hardware. The biggest reason Stanislav considered this to be an error was that he knew the United States would never just launch one missile. It would be a hellfire, a cursed rainstorm with every dropping bomb meaning death, bent on wiping the Soviets from existence. But there was only one missile detected. There had actually been some questions that had arisen about the reliability of the satellite system in the past that Stanislav was currently using, something which no doubt was in the back of Stanislav's mind. It's not really known if he did or did not inform his superiors of this alert. However, one can only assume that he didn't, with the whole Korean airline flight 007 disaster playing out in the way it did. I mean, we know that he didn't report it to like the super higher ups, but if it was just like the next guy along, we don't know if he said anything to him and they decided together. But like, yeah. Stanislav's assessment of the situation would turn out to be correct when, indeed, no missile would arrive. Until, yet again, the system would start alerting, this time detecting 4 additional ICBMs. And just like last time, Stanislav assessed the situation and determined that this was yet again another glitch in the system. If a real attack was launched, they were not going to launch just 1 or 4 missiles, it would have been hundreds. Something which Stanislav cited himself. Starting a war with 5 ICBMs made no sense when the US had hundreds if not thousands that they could have sent volleying over to the Soviet Union. Serpukhov 15's systems relied solely on satellites to provide them with this information, as their land radar detection systems were only usable up to the visible horizon, meaning that the system wouldn't be aware of an impending attack until it was far too late. If he's right though, no ICBMs arrive. And if he's wrong, well, he probably wouldn't be around to care about the consequences anyway. In the end, it was found that the false alarms had been caused by sunlight, which was hitting high altitude clouds, and the satellite did a simple check. Does this look like what I'm supposed to look for? Yes. Therefore, send alert. But just for a moment, think about what the aftermath would have been if Stanislav had informed his superiors, assuring them of the validity of the alert. The Soviets would have launched as many ICBMs as possible towards the continental United States. In turn, the US would fire back, leading both sides to think that the other had kicked off a nuclear war. Let's just say, for argument's sake, the Soviets were using missiles similar to those found during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the R-12 SS-4 Sandal. Let's assume the US was using something more traceable, like the newly, at the time, produced B-83 nuclear warhead. The R-12 is 2.4 megatons of damage, and the B-83 is 1.2 megatons. The fireball radius of the Soviet bomb is about 1.5 kilometers, and the US bomb is about 1.15 kilometers, with their overall blast radii being 26 and 21 kilometers respectively. And as you can see from this zoomed out map, the bombs, in the grand scheme of things, don't seem to do shitloads of damage, although the loss of life would be extremely significant. But let's apply the Soviet logic here. They expected hundreds, so logically, they would send hundreds back. In 2019, Princeton ran a simulation of what a nightmare attack would look like, and if this is what could happen in today's geopolitical climate, it's not hard to imagine that this next video could be a scenario that would have very well have played out in September of 1983. I do think the music on that one makes it significantly more chilling, but do you understand? The sheer amount of people that could have been vaporized in instants, the number of people buried under falling buildings, dying of radiation poisoning from nuclear fallout on both sides, two of the biggest countries politically and geographically, would suddenly become uninhabitable. The world as we know it today would never have existed. America's allies would fight Russia's allies, and all total the casualties at the end could have been uncapped. It's predicted that in 1983, around 4.5 billion people were populating this world. The US accounted for 233 million of that, and the Soviet Union accounted for 270 million. That's just over 500 million people that could have been potentially wiped out when you consider the fallout and the environmental aspects of these scenarios. 10% of the world gone. And that's not just the people. For the most part, you would never be able to go back to those places now. They're irradiated beyond repair. As I mentioned before, global conflict would be at full scale with the West and Eastern blocs, and they now have nukes. Some places like Britain could have been cleared off the world map going forward. We're an island nation, and if that many bombs gets dropped on us, how much is left? However, thanks to the good judgment of Stanislav Petrov, these are just what-if scenarios, and it's very easy to understand why he was labelled as the man who saved the world. When this was reported to his seniors, General Yuri Votintsev, commander of the Soviet air defense missile defense units, initially stated the actions of Stanislav as correct and duly noted, and was promised a reward for his actions, despite a reprimand for improper filing of paperwork. Because paperwork is important in this scenario. In reality, Stanislav received no reward. Stanislav, to the higher-ups, had only highlighted bugs that were extremely embarrassing for his superiors and the scientists that they'd worked with. So if he's rewarded, they're punished. Communism. Stanislav would be reassigned to a less sensitive post before taking early retirement, and he would go on to suffer a nervous breakdown. And to be honest, who can blame him? Ultimately, the act of starting a war would never have been his decision. It's not like he and he alone had access to a big red launch button, but still, the toll that this whole thing must have took on him mentally it would have been near catastrophic. In 1984, he would be hired to help work in the same research institute that had created the early warning system that he had worked with on that day. He would soon after just retire entirely so that he could take care of his wife Raisa following her diagnosis of cancer. In 2004, he was awarded with the World Citizen Award by the Association of World Citizens, along with a trophy and $1,000 in cash, recognizing him for helping in averting global catastrophe. In May of 2007, as part of a documentary on him, Stanislav was able to visit the Minuteman Missile National Historic Site near Wall, South Dakota. While there, he'd make just a passing comment. "I would never have imagined being able to visit one of the enemy's secure sites." Just going to show you how much that's still ingrained in there. Enemy. Friend. In 2013, he was awarded with the Dresden Peace Prize in Dresden, Germany. On the 26th of September 2018, he will be awarded with the $50,000 Future of Life Award, a ceremony which included a speech from former United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. The award was collected by Stanislav's daughter, Elena. The award was given posthumously. Stanislav Petrov passed away on the 19th of May 2017 after battling with pneumonia. No matter how much modern-day Russia will try to diminish the actions of Stanislav, saying that one man couldn't have started a war in the way we all think it would have played out, I disagree. Soviets were on edge, and even a sniff of an American nuke would have had them generals scrambling for the button to launch first. But I'll leave you with a couple of quotes. The first is from Stanislav's documentary. "All that happened didn't matter to me. It was my job. I was simply doing my job. And I was the right person at the right time. That's all. My late wife, for 10 years, knew nothing about it. So what did you do?" she asked me. "Nothing. I did nothing." Humble until the end. And the final quote is one from Albert Einstein. And this is my favorite quote of all time. Once this video ends, just think about Stanislav Petrov and think about this quote. Look around you at the things that you have. Think about where you've come from and where you're heading in the future. And just let this quote sink in. And just count yourself lucky. And also hope that stronger minds will always prevail. I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones.